Okay. Okay, we're ready for countdown.
Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Poultry Fresh podcast. We began having these conversations with the goal of forming our XPRIZE team, and we continue to explore ideas that may become the most impactful sustainability solutions. I'm Laurel Tincher. This episode features a recording of our Clubhouse room with special guest Dahl Winters, CTO of DeepScience Ltd. And member of OpenAir Collective. Dahl was interviewed by our CEO, Arin Crumley.
We want to talk about two things today, deep science and also what you're doing with the OpenAir Collective. Let's do a choose your own adventure. Dahl, which would you prefer to talk about first?
I'll talk about the deep science first, I think.
Okay, great. Now, we're going to obviously learn what that is, but can you give it to us in the form of a story? Like, tell us, like, what was the beginning? What was your start with deep science? And through that narrative, maybe we can learn about what it is.
Yes, of course. So once again, thank you everyone for having me on board today. I'm the CTO of DeepScience Ltd. We're a company that originated in Colorado in 2015, and our goal is to build systems for science and sustainability purposes. We've built a number of systems. We actually have an ongoing relationship with a pharmaceutical company, which I'll get into a little bit. We also have a laboratory that we do some R&D work at. And we are very interested in continuing to build systems, but also more on a climate change bent. So we're taking these systems that we build, and they're mixed software, hardware in the past, but now they're more they're broader types of systems, biological, mixed biological, as well as technological systems. One of the things that we open sourced was a device called Cyan, and that is something that you'll hear about from the OpenAir Collective portion of the talk as well. So when we're ready to get into that, let me know. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, great. So there's a few things we're going to want to unpack here. One is just we're talking about systems. Everything's a system, so maybe we put more constraints on the exact kind of systems we're talking about. So that's one curiosity. But maybe even before we get into that, your role as CTO is interesting. It's obviously a very technical role. So you must have gone on some kind of trajectory of discovery for yourself that you're into technical things. You're into, eventually you realize that you're into carbon-related technology and systems. But if we were to back way up in your life, like what was it that made you know that you want to get into this very technical stuff?
Well, I've always been a technical person. I started playing with Legos when I was 5 years old, and that kind of took me. My parents recognized that I would just sit downstairs and do that for 5 hours. That's the kind of person I am. I love to explore. I love to build things, and everything else has been sort of a learning experience for me. How to get into business, how to market myself, how to get other people on board, how to manage companies. And what I've done is mostly focus on the R&D side of things. I've applied my biology and my chemistry and my computer science skills towards building mixed types of systems. I try to synthesize things from the knowledge that I have and apply them towards pressing problems, and that's what we tend to do here.
Super cool. And now these systems. So let's get real specific. By the way. We can get very technical. This is what we like to do in Clubhouse. And we can take notes so that it's clear what we're talking about. Right now, Laurel and I think it's Christian logged in as the Poultry Fresh little cursor. So we're all online right now, and we're we're flying around in this one whiteboard space. Anyone listening is welcome to look at it. For the recorded version, it will still be there. It's called room 6.6.2021, Dahl Winters. And so in order to find this link, the easiest thing is to just type in poll-to-refresh.team, and then on that page, we link to a digital whiteboard, and it just takes you into this sprawling space. You can infinitely zoom out, infinitely zoom in. So all of the notes of any of the conversations we have on Clubhouse are in there. So let's try to understand very precisely what it is, the different systems that you're working on, and kind of as much as you can tell us about how they work, because we're obsessed here at Poll to Refresh with getting as much CO2 out of the air and learning of all the different methods that there are to do that, and throwing our efforts and energy and even financial resources towards these methods. So what kind of systems can you tell us about that are relevant to that?
Yes, well, I will focus on one system, and that's the one that we're currently elaborating upon with the Air Miners Launchpad. I'm one of the team members on board the Air Miners Launchpad. As you know, it's I think you are as well, Arin or Arin. Are you also on there?
We're also registered on Air Miners. We're not doing this Launchpad round, but maybe we'll do the next one.
Okay, perfect. So the system, in case that we're going to talk about today, is one where we're using marine organisms, and these are specifically calcareous organisms, to take CO2 from the water. This is an example of instead of direct air carbon capture, it's more direct water carbon capture. As you know, CO2 goes into the water. It becomes, these organisms can create calcium carbonate from that CO2, and it's a process that is a very permanent process of storing CO2 within these organisms. Now, in the process of growing them, most people say, well, they're just storing CO2. Corals do that everywhere. There are other types of organisms that do this everywhere. How do you make money from this? And one of our approaches is to link that up with the creation of pharmaceuticals, potentially agents that have medicinal value within these types of organisms. And we found some research papers that show that these have a lot of value. Like, for example, the medical device or medical coatings industry, when you coat medical devices, that experiences a CAGR, combined or compound annual growth rate, in the double digits. So we're looking at high growth areas and trying to couple those with, of course, taking CO2 out of the air. Now, that type of system requires some monitoring. It requires, of course, area to grow these organisms. We're planning to do it on a coastal area, so it's not conflicting with land uses. This will be a relatively high density grow environment, and so it doesn't take up that much oceanfront space. We found an area that actually will allow us to perform some trial runs. But we've looked at 1,000 tons a day. We've looked at the capacity that we would need for 1 million tons a day, or 1 million tons a year, sorry. And then, of course, scaling up to gigaton levels, what that would look like. And it requires a large area, but it's definitely doable on the coast of the United States. Will require some help with people. But we basically design the system. And by system, we mean a system in all respects of the word, not just technology, but the what it would look like from having people involved, what it will look like financially, what it will look like with the technology, of course, that will be needed to manage these systems. So, does that help?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So now when we're talking about these microorganisms, and by the way, it's not just me asking the questions, I'm just kind of getting things started here. So anyone who has questions who's up here on the stage, Definitely chime in with questions that you've got for Dahl as we go through this. But the next thing I was wondering was which microorganisms are you growing?
These are actually not microorganisms. They are macroorganisms. They're actually a form of algae. We have specific species that we look at that actually store calcium carbonate within their skeletons.
Okay, so they're skeletons. So there what species are? So it's maybe a variety, because of course an ecosystem makes more sense than just one singular species. Is that the idea, that it's kind of you say system? It's an ecosystem.
It is an ecosystem. Yes, precisely.
Okay, so multiple species. So what categories of species are we talking? Phytoplankton? Are we talking actual like macro algae, like kelp and things, or just all of the above?
Yeah, we're not looking at kelp specifically because they aren't calcareous. The thing with kelp is they grow really fast. They have rapid growth rates. But for the XPRIZE, they tend to, once harvested, they are like any kind of biomass. Unless you convert them to a form that does not decay, the CO2 will eventually go back into the atmosphere. Now, if you sink it deep into the ocean, then the CO2 may stay locked away a little longer. But once again, you still have the breakdown of CO2, or the release of CO2 over time. And so we're looking for a very permanent solution, something that we can mix into, say, for example, harvest, and then have this material, the calcareous material, used as for potential building products, used in aquariums, for example, saltwater aquariums, where it's really expensive to buy the sand that's used in those aquariums. We're trying to link this up to high-value product.
Got it. And so calcareous, forgive me for not knowing the term. So how can we further define what this is? I imagine it's calcium skeletons built up. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, precisely. They are calcium skeletons, so calcium carbonate specifically. This is the material that is the CO2 storage form. So we have isolated some species of these organisms that build skeletons, and we're not sure if we're ready to release just all the species names as of yet. But these are things that we're currently growing, and they are they grow at a fairly fast rate.
Right. Yeah, okay. And so we know the things that grow in the ocean, of course, obviously. There's many options. So that's cool.
Question. So are you able to say what the connection is between, I'm presuming it's not the calcium carbonate that is connected to the medicinal products, but other applications of the organisms itself?
Yeah.
Are you able to comment on that?
Yeah, I can definitely comment on that. So when these organisms are ground up, they have there's a solid extract and then a liquid extract. The solid is going to be primarily, and this is an organism that varies between 70 to 85% calcium carbonate skeletons. So it's pretty pure, and they are actually producing this, and entire reefs are built up over time, over a long periods of time, from the skeletons of these marine animals. So you can probably guess from that what they might be. Or not animals, these are marine, they are macroalgae of some form. The medicinal value comes from the liquid extract. So this is, there's been research papers which have been, we've cited, that show that these organisms produce a lot of antiviral, antimicrobial types of compounds. And our goal is to try to isolate those even further and collaborate with potentially a pharmaceutical company to develop these out further. So this will help drive the ecosystem for developing more products off of the back of CO2 sequestration.
And I mean, I don't know. You said you modeled production rates into megatons and gigatons. Presumably, the market doesn't follow you to those scales. I suppose you have another either long-term storage versus what can be capitalized into market products.
Yeah, so the immediate product that we can actually offer for that is a product of the CO2 sequestration is a sandy material, which is basically the calcium carbonate formed into small fragments that are of a certain size and quality. And this sandy material could be used in building structures. It could be used in aquariums. There's plenty of aquariums for paving material. For basically anywhere you would use sand, you can also use the sand that's derived from a particular form of calcium carbonate.
Mm-hmm. Is it the fine sand on those refined beaches? Just have to ask.
Yeah. Yes, precisely. Yes, it's very fine sand.
Oh, it's interesting.
So this is how we would scale up to gigatons. I mean, basically, you have to put all of this material somewhere, and you have to have enough grow space in order to have people harvest the material. And we've calculated that if we have about a person per acre actually tending this crop, essentially, it's definitely a crop in its own right. We're farming carbon, and we're going to sequester it in calcium carbonate. Once you have enough people doing this, it will create jobs. We can sell the product on the market to replace existing products that aren't made in a clean manner. And then, of course, there's the biotechnology aspect of things, which, to my knowledge, very few other CO2 sequestration ventures are actually getting into.
Yeah, well, I love this because, you see it at the beach, all these little white shells, and when you start messing around, just even learning just the basics of the ocean life, you see all these structures, and it's clearly, it's got that calcium, and we want to get the calcium carbonate out of the water. In case this is not obvious to people who have not been diving deeper into this, can you explain the relationship between these white skeletons of these tiny little critters and creatures in the ocean and the CO2 in the air? Because, I mean, we all learn in school, you breathe out, the tree breathes it in. Yes, there's a circular system here going on. But this is quite a different leap, that somehow this little white skeleton's related to the CO2 in the air.
Yeah, of course. So the ocean has stored a vast amount of CO2, and that CO2 has been pulled out of the air. So you can imagine this giant vacuum cleaner that you might have. If you're removing CO2 from the ocean in the form of calcium carbonate, that leaves room for more CO2 to be pulled into the ocean from the air. The concentration of CO2 in the ocean is something like 150 times that in the air. So you're much more efficient in removing it from water than you are from the air through direct air capture. Most of the resources that have been put into how to remove carbon from the air have been put into units that could operate more efficiently were they in the water. Now, these marine organisms, like plants on land, make biomass from CO2. And there are plants and animals in the ocean. I should say plants loosely because they're actually early forms of plants that convert CO2 into their CO2 in the water, and they convert this, it's in the form of bicarbonate actually, into shells. And so when you walk on the beach, you're walking on shells. The Earth has done this for millennia, for eons. You're walking on what would otherwise be CO2 that was in the air. It's been stored as a compound which is in the ocean, and that actually gets taken up and stored as calcium carbonate in these shells. The calcium comes from the water. The carbonate event mostly comes from the air and from other sources on land from weathering. So the ocean has a lot of capacity to absorb new CO2 if it's not so full of CO2 to begin with, so full of this carbonate material. So the more we can take out, the more we can capture, and we're actually helping the Earth's carbon cycle in the process.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty clear. I mean, I guess just to reframe some of that, the simplest, would you agree with this simplest way of stating it, which is to simply say that trees love CO2, and we all know that, but there's very little of it in the air, but that's okay. They've evolved to work with that. All kinds of sea creatures, not all of them, but certain sea creatures love the CO2 that's in the air dissolved, which is no longer called CO2. It's called some other technical thing. We won't worry about that. But it's in there. It's in the water. And they love that. And they can work with it a lot more easily because there's so much more of it and there is so much life. And that's why, we could even accuse the planet of already having been ruined by many, many previous species that just spent millions of years ruining the planet, turning it into what it wanted. And that's what we evolved in. So we consider this to be the gold standard. This is how the Earth should be. But actually, it's been changed many, many times by all kinds of species going nuts. But the current version of the Earth that we all live in, just basically is in the ocean constantly doing this. All these different creatures, some of them... I guess some of them are alive, some of them are, like you said, early versions of a plant, algae. They can all be categorized in a bunch of different ways, but they're all just working with this. And when you can make that sand and make that as a product, that's interesting. So there's a few directions we can take this conversation. We can look more into product ideas. Maybe we can even brainstorm or think of some different cool ideas of things that can be done with that. The other direction that we can take it is this question around nutrients. I imagine you're going to say something like, there's a lot of nutrients that have run off from the agricultural industry, and actually we need as many sponges as we can get to get those out of the coastal areas. Is that the general idea here, or will you be providing nutrients in some way to kind of farm and harvest this all?
There are already plenty of nutrients in the water, so these organisms actually are not the kinds that are associated with algae blooms. These are the ones that they actually like water that is lower in nutrients than usual. So the fact that we have high levels of nutrients means that we can actually do more with those nutrients than we otherwise would with these algae blooming types. I should mention that there are some marine organisms that are microalgae. For example, there are coccolithophores. These are shell-forming organisms, which are microorganisms. They are blooming so much in the ocean you can actually see them from space. These are organisms that take a lot of CO2 from the water and sink that, they sink down to the ocean floor eventually. So what we're doing is not unlike this natural system, but we're also able to extract other products from the use of these types of algae.
And how does it not end up at the bottom of the ocean? You've got some kind of a screen system to catch these things and be able to bring it back for aquariums and stuff?
Well, these we would actually grow on sheltered bays or areas that are relatively shallow. So this would actually help form a little bit of the structures that we would build would maybe help out wetland ecosystems a little bit, surrounding wetlands as well. There are a lot of shallow locations along the coastline, particularly on the East Coast. And we've identified a few spots where the areas are actually possibly in need of economic development as well. So we could funnel in money to those places. These places would provide good sources of labor, good sources of, we would actually be helping the local communities, and we would be providing them with something that is doable for the long term. So it seems like a win-win for all types.
Right. And it's good that it creates jobs because, who likes to create jobs is usually governments. And so what are your thoughts on the kind of regulatory approval? Obviously, the fact that it has so many benefits. I mean, look, you're trying to get CO2. Who's going to turn this down? It sounds like a killer deal. And yet we do know that even the most well-intentioned projects sometimes struggle to get permission to do these great, wonderful things. So obviously you're looking at that. What are the regulatory considerations or potential hurdles in getting this going?
We've already identified a landowner who actually owns some water as well due to having water rights from that person's land. And this is a place where we can possibly set up a pilot project for this. So if there is a pilot and it turns out to work well, there are obviously ways of spreading the news around and then showing people that this is actually doable on a significant scale. So as far as regulatory purposes, of course there are regulations that are with using any kind of pharmaceutical type of product. And we have a laboratory that can help us navigate how to harness that portion of the business. But certainly with the sand portion, it's just if you're harvesting organisms that grow in the sand for things that can be made that you can make into additional finer types of sand, that shouldn't be a problem with regulatory agencies. That's basically anyone who owns land along the coast could potentially get some compensation for letting us adopt that land for the use of carbon sequestration through these marine organisms.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry to cut in, but Dahl, if I'm understanding.
Ching, can you introduce yourself? Because we also are going to record this and have some other listeners who don't see who's talking.
Oh, all right. I'm Ching Shu. I am a co-founder of a company that's trying to make 3D printers, a 3D printer network that connects with an online catalog and addresses shortages in the supply chain. I'm also a biologist turned engineer and business person, so my interests very much align with the topic, and thank you so much for having the room today. So yeah, that's who I am. Dahl, I want to say I really appreciate the conscientiousness at which you're approaching this problem, because I think a lot of people who are trying to sequester carbon, they look 1 or 2 steps in to lock that carbon, but they don't think about where their product goes. If I can ask a clarifying question, my understanding of this is that it would really help you and what you're doing if you could have a provable market or source for calcium carbonate, like not particularly the ones that come from limestone or other traditional sources, but specifically like farmed calcium carbonate based on the diatoms or the macroalgae or whatever it is you are growing?
Yes, there is a market for example, the type of calcium carbonate that we will be growing is called aragonite. And you can look up aragonite and find out that there's several companies that actually mine natural sources of aragonite in the Bahamas. These sources, while they are biogenic sources, they naturally occur, and you can harvest the sand from. There's really a lot of shipping that takes place of sand from the Bahamas to the U.S. There's of course distribution and such. What we would try to do is there's a lot of saltwater aquariums along the coast, and if we actually supply those aquariums directly with the type of sand that they would otherwise get from these farther sources, that would be one place that we could deposit our calcium carbonate and to have a product. It's also used in agriculture. It doesn't have that long of a storage time. Permanence, CO2 permanence is, of course, important for the XPRIZE. So much more can be used in agriculture than can be used in aquariums, but the value of that used in aquariums is much higher than that used in agriculture and buildings. I should say buildings are an important source of where we would use our sand as well, because that's very permanent.
Yeah, so my understanding is you want to capture this carbon in the form of calcium carbonate, and then put it in sources that don't cycle it back into the carbon cycle, so that they don't wind up back in the atmosphere, they don't wind up back in the ocean, they don't wind up there. We're sequestering, we're doing what happened a long time ago, but at a real world, more modernized scale. So I suppose I really appreciate that you're looking into building materials and more permanent sources. There is research being done into 3D printing with calcium carbonate, and I also know that insofar as bioprinting goes, in terms of use in the human body, do you know whether feasibly your calcium carbonate that you produce could be used for bioprinting human skeletons for medical research or reasons like that?
Yeah, the human skeletons are actually made of calcium phosphate.
So, I really think that the use of resources in the ocean for new and innovative ways, 3D printing human skeletons, you can't get more innovative than that. Even if it isn't exactly the right same material, they make hip replacements out of all kinds of materials that are not the material that grows in the body. So it's pretty interesting to think through both the niche products as well as the kind of major industrial ones. I was looking up how much various shell flakes are in concrete currently, and it does make up a certain percentage. The exact number can be found online looking that up, but so it seems like that can also be increased. Is that an area that you're looking into? Concrete additives to, it doesn't change the fact that you would have the cement, but you could, instead of aggregate and other things that might actually have a carbon footprint, this could be a carbon negative actually alternative, right?
Yes, and that will probably roll into our talk about the OpenAir Collective, which actually does some policy around low embodied carbon concrete. And one of the things that we can do with concrete is actually use other materials to lower the amount of cement that's actually being used. Instead of aggregate, potentially you can add in a proportion of this material of calcium carbonate. You still need quartz and other things in your concrete for structural integrity, but it's definitely possible to add calcium carbonate, lime essentially. You will hear about cement lime products. They're currently for sale at any hardware store. If you search for cement lime, this is something that's being used in businesses right now that are building new buildings. And as we know, concrete is the number one by tonnage material that we actually produce in the world today. Nothing else is more available, more commonly used, more growing as humans develop larger cities and bigger buildings, concrete is here to stay. And that's one of the things that I was attracted by with the OpenAir Collective, was their not just the R&D mission, which I'll get into a bit, but also the advocacy mission.
Okay, well now you've built up the anticipation. What is the OpenAir Collective, and what is your role with it?
Yes, I'm just a member of the OpenAir Collective, but there are some fine people there. It's a community of about 300 people. There are about 50 of us who are really strongly active, and then there's a few others within the 300 who just monitor how things go. But we do advocacy and R&D. Advocacy around building the market for low embodied carbon concrete. Basically, it's called LEC. You'll hear about, if you go to the OpenAir Collective's website, there's something called LEC-LA, the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act. And this is an advocacy initiative to try to get states to adopt regulations. And these regulations are along the lines of, if you look into how much carbon your cement is going to have, this will be a good thing, and this will actually help the cement industry and these industries that are trying to substitute cement with other things. This is what we're trying to do, and at the OpenAir Collective, we're trying to make open up the market, open up opportunities for suppliers of these alternative materials, and also to sequester carbon directly in the cement as well. Companies like Carbon Cure, Carbon Built, these other companies that you might be aware of that participated in the last Carbon Removal XPRIZE. They're doing wonders with concrete and storing CO2 within them. So that's that, and then there's the R&D side of things. I am leading an initiative, the Cyan Initiative, and you might have heard about Cyan. It's a small-scale DIY direct air carbon capture device. It does, on average, about 2 grams of CO2 a day per 10 grams of input material. In contrast, to scale up, we're going to need a lot more than just gram levels. But it opens the door to understanding carbon removal by anyone. It's ultimately accessible by anyone. Basically, for $20 to $100, and really you can buy the minimum unit for just $20. You can build this yourself and experience carbon removal in your own home by weighing the material before and after it's absorbed carbon. And so this is directly related to what I was discussing earlier that we're doing at Deep Science with marine organisms. Both of these approaches involve the conversion of some calcium-based material along with CO2, and carbonation occurs to make calcium carbonate, which is basically what marine shells are made of. We make it in our Cyan units as using calcium hydroxide or magnesium hydroxide. We actually this is a product that's available off the store shelves right now. You can find it as hydrated lime at your hardware store, and in various levels of purity. You will get various levels of purity of calcium carbonate from these store-bought products. Now, of course, if you have like a higher grade of calcium hydroxide, you can make higher grades of calcium carbonate from the CO2. But this is entirely meant for somebody to be able to experience carbon removal at home and to get started in building these units, making them better, seeing what can be applied to these units to make them better, to make them more efficient, to put a personal taste to some of these units. They could use a little bit of artistic design. They could be just the thought of something that costs like $20 to $100. Just being able to be out there and evolved by anybody, not just a scientist. It could be an artist or anyone. is really
So I have a question about this Cyan project. So it's CYAN, by the way. So if people want to Google that, as well as we are putting like we're writing this stuff out again on the Miro board for anyone who didn't hear earlier. You go to poll2refresh.team. That's our website, and we link from there to a digital whiteboard. And if you scroll down, well, right now it's the last one on the list, but if you're hearing the recording, you'll go to 6/6/2021 and look at that. The notes from that room, you'll see everything we're talking about. So is this kind of something to compare to sea monkeys, or is that like, it's not quite it? Because it sounds like you'd be adding different powders and things, and in a way doing a small version of what you're talking about doing in the bay with your prototype.
Yes, but it's like that. With the Cyan unit, you're basically you're using powder materials, and you're converting the CO2 in the air to calcium carbonate. With what we're doing with marine organisms, those are actual real organisms that we're growing, and so the Cyan unit just uses industrially produced powder, which in that case doesn't involve living things, but it is meant as it is a smaller scale approach to what we're planning.
And how what should we read into when you say put 10 grams in and get 2 grams out? Are we saying like it's actually not a total net negative, but it demonstrates something scientifically? Or are you saying like, no, it's actually a net negative, it's just that's some catalyst or something that's like helping it do its thing?
Yes, it is. It can be net negative if you acquire your calcium hydroxide from a low carbon source, and there are some low carbon sources. Brimstone Energy is developing a low carbon source. Basically, all the other sources of calcium hydroxide will probably come from calcination. It's a really high temperature process, so that's likely not to be low carbon. So it can be carbon negative. Right now we're looking at it being at best carbon neutral, depending on where you get your inputs from. But certainly as these other sources come online, they're going to be more available. You can buy them at about the same cost as current calcium hydroxide. Yeah, so I think that, did that help answer the question?
Yeah, no, that's great. Although I still don't understand, what is the chemical process happening there?
Yes, it is calcium hydroxide plus CO2 yields calcium carbonate.
Okay, so inside, is calcium hydroxide dissolved in water?
Yeah, there's water as well. Yeah, so calcium hydroxide plus CO2 with a coating of water within water gives you calcium carbonate plus H2O, actual H2O there.
And so the calcium carbonate, are we just creating seawater? Is that what just happened there? Or like
seawater has a mixture of other things in it, but what you're creating there is you're actually making the same material that seashells are made of.
In a solid form? Because I was thinking the calcium. Oh, it's not a calcium bicarbonate. It's not actually the dissolved. It's actually you end up with something solid there, less similar to the shell.
Yes, you're ending up with calcium carbonate. So not
calcium carbonate. Yeah, okay. I was like, did you just dissolve it and it's still dissolved? My water turned into water. No. You're going to actually see something get made. So it's not sea monkeys exactly. It's more of a kind of material project. You mentioned art, so you could put it in a mold. You could actually make this thing that you pull out of a mold or cookie cutter type thing, and you've got this flat pan, and now you could say, hey, I made this out of CO2 in the air.
Precisely, and we've actually done that. That's one of the things that is on the OpenAirForum.org, that website. One of the things that we've done is to make concrete molds. It's one part of Portland cement to one part of biochar to one part of calcium carbonate. Or you can do 2 parts of calcium carbonate to 1 part Portland cement. But if you make that and mold it in a silicone mold, you can make a variety of different forms that are actually quite sturdy.
Very cool.
So I'm curious.
Yeah, go ahead, Serena.
I have to ask, the organism that it grows in the marine environment, is it rocky environment or sand, and does it really need to be on the coast?
It needs to be in a shallow environment, so it does not need to be on the coast, but that's typically where you find shallow environments. It just needs to be accessible someplace where there's enough sunlight, not huge amounts of sunlight, so it could be actually a little bit deeper. They're found commonly in very shallow environments to environments like around 30 meters or so, potentially, which is about 120 feet or a little less than that. So these organisms, they require a variety of substrates. They can grow on rock. They can grow on sandy substrates. Sand will allow them to propagate even further, so they're actually growing even more. So these are the options for growth. And if I know that there are some projects to do kelp in the deep sea, out of international waters. That, of course, requires a lot of transportation costs, but the idea there is you can actually, if you had floating platforms of this stuff, you could grow them out there and then just, of course, that would raise the costs, and we're trying to fit within the confines of what can we do the most with the $1 million or so that the XPRIZE would give the top 15 teams. To prove that we can actually get 1,000 tons of carbon removed per year.
Well, offshore is certainly where I was going, as you can imagine.
We love offshore.
And we certainly, in other contracts, we could get into a fuller cost analysis. But I'm curious, though, in terms of the synergies that might be on the offer of having a calcium carbonate production coexisting with kelp and other kinds of direct capture, particularly in the context of the longer term production of construction materials, not to transport to land, but to continue growing the offshore operation, for example.
Now that's interesting. Yes, you could definitely use the calcium carbonate to offshore as well. Instead of taking it back to land, it could be used to grow, like if it's not too far out, maybe like a platform or so, where it's a floating platform. Things can grow. It's not growing at the surface, but maybe a few meters underneath, just something that's buoyed to the surface so that it stays near the sun. But you could use the calcium carbonate that comes from the dead organisms when they leave their skeletons behind, and actually use that to build up like an artificial floating reef potentially. That certainly is a possibility.
Well, because we often discuss composites, and those are bringing together several channels of chemicals together. The binder was brought up earlier from Ching Ching's question, but in terms of forms of direct air capture and calcium carbonate and other types of upscaling chemistries that might produce resins on site, there's a variety of things that calcium carbonate could add to. So it's an interesting opportunity for synergistic applications in offshore carbon capture.
Yes, that's an excellent idea.
Yeah, just to also kind of reframe that for anyone who's feeling like we just rattled off a lot of chemistry. We're talking about Like, let's say you make something out of carbon or out of like a resin. What if we can strengthen it with fibers? That's what carbon fiber is. Everyone loves carbon fiber because you just add this lightweight structure to the resin, which is basically like a plastic, but we'll just call it like resin or even just carbon, basically. But if you could, instead of making fibers or even nanotubes or different things that you would use as your strengthener, you put this little structure, this what used to be living, all these tiny little skeletons smashed up, and that's or not even smashed up, maybe just left intact. They're already strong. If they're putting that in concrete, it's not that different than the cement being used for the strength, and the little actual various chunks of things to give you spacing, but kind of a cellular spacing, just the way anything needs volume. If you're just densely strong, that's actually not as good as if you're strong across a larger amount of space. So it seems like there's probably a lot of things that could be done to turn what you've got there into products, and to think contextually about where it's being made and then what products could be made right there. This is, it was mentioned earlier, like 3D printing human bones. 3D printing in general, like just making things on the fly is pretty incredible, but currently there's still this filament idea. Like, you're going to take a spool and ship it somewhere, and then it's going to be formed at the last minute into something. But once you start getting to, OpenAir Collective ideas, or air miners, or, any direct air capture, or working with the chemicals that are in the air, turning them into something physical, you're basically kind of running a 3D printer. If you have some way, like, regardless of this idea that, it's going to magically be turned into an exact, precise object, maybe you still need molds or some kind of other way to work it into a shape. But just the fact that you can materialize something of physical strength from either thin air or just seawater, or the combination of both, is pretty dang interesting. And I think it's kind of one of these, like, twisted things, like, oh man, I wish we could get all the CO2 out of the air. What a bummer that we're going to have to do that. It's just going to be such a pain. But actually, if it's happening in lockstep with these other kind of epiphanies, like, wait a minute, why do we have an international, supply chain of, like, this country makes this one specialty thing and they ship it all over the world, when you can actually get most of the things that you need just readily from water and air? So what have we been doing wrong this whole time? What are your thoughts on that, Dahl? Do you think that there's a bigger picture shift coming here that might usher in some of this CO2 removal that really super needs to happen?
Yes, I would say there definitely is. The shift in understanding has to come from people recognizing there's an economic opportunity with CO2. We create products from things that we see on land. We have fisheries from things that we see in the ocean, and marine products from a variety of sand products and things. But if you can take what's in the air and actually use it as a product in itself, recognizing that most of the CO2 in the air goes into the ocean. And once it's in the ocean, if you can remove that CO2 from the ocean, it's going to suck up more from the air. Just recognizing that and seeing the economic opportunities available with doing a project for sequestering carbon from the ocean itself, and turning it into a variety of compounds that would help people in that have certain medicinal values that you can use for sand, that could be used in building structures. Basically, you're transforming one type of property, which is air, into multiple things. You're using it as earth. You're using it as water. You're basically revitalizing the industry around we think of air as just something we breathe and exhale, but it can be more than just that if we recognize the properties of it.
It reminds me of The Matrix. I mean, just because in that story, he sort of realizes, wait a minute, the entire environment that I'm in is just made up of ones and zeros, and I can turn the ones and zeros into any other thing. Well, in that case, I can just make anything happen. And it's sort of hilarious that at a certain level of understanding of chemistry is a huge part of it, but there's, potentially to achieve certain things, maybe robotics, definitely electronics. You can kind of start to, almost arrive at a matrix level, okay, there's now enough understanding of reality, the reality that's around us, to know how to have it be malleable into what it is that we need. And so it's interesting because it paints this path of just greater dexterity. Right now, we only know to burn natural gas and fossil fuels, and that's all we really know. And we're getting into solar and wind, and so those are interesting, but they sometimes have their limitations in certain applications. So and same with manufacturing. We all we know is cement. It's just the number one thing that we're just using everywhere, and it has a huge carbon footprint. So I think it's interesting that we start to get all these other alternatives, and one could choose to use one because of its niche benefits for that application. And so that's what I mean by more dexterity, more options, more things that we know how to do than the just kind of default givens. But one challenge, and we've looked at this a lot, we've looked into different industries that could be disrupted by making something in an eco alternative, or even just a disrupting price. Just a new way of thinking about it achieves something at a much more attractive price. And yet we see in the world, historically, you see lots of projects that had a more attractive price, had an eco kind of angle, and even with all of those things going for it, it doesn't always get adopted. I'm not trying to be cynical or a downer over here. I'm just pointing out that there are other factors at play, such as habit, investment in prior architecture and infrastructure. And so, have you thought much about the challenge there in creating new product lines? There's kind of you have to train old dogs new tricks. And do you have any thoughts on that, or approaches that you think can help that, maybe especially from the OpenAir Collective perspective, just that if there's all these new ways of doing concrete, how do you get everybody to accept them?
Well, one of the things we have in the U.S. and many areas throughout the world is a free market economy. And there certainly are drivers of certain needs. If you have a need for a product, it won't be hard to actually find customers for that product if there's a need that exists out there. And I think with all of these new ways of doing cement, of making different forms of concrete from that cement, there are established players in the industry that want it done a certain way, and then there are all these challengers that are coming. Well, time always proceeds in one direction. It always proceeds forward. And over time, things change. And so I think that if what we develop is better than what has been developed in the past in terms of cost savings or strength or different properties that we haven't imagined before, there will come a time when people will demand that more so than anything else. And that will help open up markets that haven't existed before.
Yeah, just the tractor of time. We roll forward and we make progress, and some people some industries end up maybe underneath that tractor in time. But it's sometimes it's a thing that requires some patience. But I like your answer about just it's evolution. It's time. It's going to happen. And so another kind of it's somewhat related because it's kind of on this track of thinking through products and like, how do you make this stuff make money so that it can happen? Unless we're going to reinvent capitalism in the next 10 years and become sort of some Star Trek civilization that's like post-money, we don't actually use money to get things done. Unless that's going to happen overnight, we're probably going to have to do all of this within the confines of capitalism, right? So, because that's how you move the world forward. So obviously it's very exciting to think of all these products as the answer. The industry of fish tank sand is only so big, so it's necessary to think through these products. But there's this other amazing thing going on we haven't talked about yet in this chat today, which is the volunteer markets. So I'm curious what you think about those. Like, just to give people some context, you've got companies like Stripe buying up from very new companies like us. I think some of those companies are also on the air miners. In the air miners, they're in the circles that are hanging out with all the air miners. So companies that don't necessarily have third-party verification of their tons just yet, but they're going to. Companies that maybe don't really even have an operation in some cases. Stripe has actually said, we like the idea. We're going to give the money. We're going to pre-buy a bunch of tons because we want to create the market, the industry from scratch. We want to be the customer that didn't exist and make this happen. Microsoft has done some of that. Google has done some of that. I mean, no one's probably as aggressive as Stripe, as well as Shopify, who seems to be following Stripe's lead, which is pretty cool to see as well. So what do you think about that? Is that something that you guys are looking to do? Sell some straight up just tons, just certificate tons to some of these companies that are trying to show the world, like, look, we may not be able to get a teraton out of the air, but we can do our part at least to neutralize our own emissions. And they are throwing down, and they have the money, and they're throwing it down. So are you going to try to fund your operation partly through that?
Well, we haven't thought much about handing out certificates, but that's certainly a possibility. One of the reasons that we haven't thought much about it is because there are a lot of carbon offset companies now that provide these offsets for those who can't sequester CO2 themselves. They are able to help themselves remove CO2 and by on the backs of others, basically. The carbon offset market is already pretty large, but it's not carbon removal for most of these companies. We want to do real carbon removal. And so if what you're doing is actually providing certificates for actually removing carbon from the air, that's something we might be interested in for sure. But yeah, I'll wait to hear more about that.
Yeah. Obviously, there's some weird stuff out there. I'm only referring to, we don't have to call it a certificate, but basically the selling to a customer that wants removal to happen.
Yes, that would be fine by us. Yeah, that we would certainly like to work around those parameters, definitely, to help fund our initiative.
And then let me ask you this kind of wild question. Do you think the general public would ever be willing to pay for that kind of a thing?
The general public is already paying through companies such as Climeworks, Nori, for example. They're already paying for these carbon removal tons, and so the market is growing. We see the possibility of this growth occurring if people can, if they can have a direct line to how much carbon is being removed. They can actually see the carbon being removed. That would actually be even better to give them a more close, hands-on look. And that's probably why I've been interested in the OpenAir Collective's mission with Cyan and with their other product, the open source product Violet. They are really interested in using having volunteers actually come aboard and make these products even better, so that we can showcase carbon removal at a and it's basically we have these volunteers that are able to take this forward and do these wonderful activities, but they are there's of course, for a company that is engaged in the space, we need to be able to provide something to customers as well. So these are two separate models that we're looking at, engaged in. The open source volunteer collective to help drive certain types of things forward that we couldn't drive as a company ourselves.
Very cool. And so we have a few listeners who popped in. Laurel, can you just give some overview context? We'll refer to that as resetting the room. Go ahead.
Sure. Welcome to all of our new listeners, and also you're welcome to come up on stage and ask a question or make a comment if you would like to do that. Our club is called Pull to Refresh. We are an XPRIZE team competing in the Elon Musk prize for carbon removal. You can follow along with what we're talking about today if you go to pulltorefresh.team, TEAM. There's a link there to a digital whiteboard where we're taking notes on this super interesting conversation with Dahl Winters, who's the CTO of DeepScience and the OpenAir Collective. And yeah, that's our research.
Thank you. So let's open it up a bit. Who else has some questions for Dahl?
I had an interesting. So I thought it was interesting when you were talking about sand. So I'm like, it sounds, okay, sand. But I was just there actually is a worldwide shortage of sand because of just erosion. I know, the Florida coasts are being replenished all the time with sand that they're getting elsewhere, sometimes from kind of shady contractors, or there are islands in Asia that are kind of fighting over sand supply. Is the kind of sand that that you're able to produce, Dahl, is that useful to that market?
The sand that we're producing, that we're planning to produce on a larger scale, would be aragonite sand. And so aragonite sand is one of those. I'm not sure if that's exactly the sand that you're referring to, but it is in short supply.
Okay.
And I can look that up real quick.
I have a really stupid question. My question is, what is sand? I mean, I know that we said earlier, it's actually just a lot of shells and, calcium carbonate. But it's not entirely that. It's also some ground up rocks, right? I think. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yes.
Mostly silicon, silicon dioxide.
Yeah, silicon dioxide. Yeah, it's essentially quartz. Silicon dioxide is a quartz material. And the sand that we're looking at using it can be made of a variety of materials. Much of it is clear grained, which is the quartz material. What we're making is more of an opaque, round type of substance, which is essentially sand. Desert sand. There's plenty of sand around the world that comes from deserts. That's actually pretty much useless for construction because the grains are too smooth to lock together. But our sand can be a variety of forms depending on how they're processed. So, but this sand is basically it's aragonite sand. So it's made from calcium carbonate. It's not going to hold up as much as a quartz sand, but it is something that could be used in cement.
Okay, cool. And by the way, I was realizing that actually I don't understand the intervention of growing it, because if it has enough, if it doesn't need much nutrients, it can just grow. What intervention is happening there? I mean, is it just really collecting the fact that it's out there growing naturally? Is it really just harvesting something wild? Is this wild caught sand?
Yeah, it's the intervention of growing it is a way of not disturbing marine waters. So you're not actually if you're out in the ocean and you're dredging up the seafloor for sand, that's actually a problem. It stirs up a lot of sediment and other things. What we're doing is in a more coastal sheltered environment, we would be able to take this material, harvest it, and
but what is your intervention to make it happen? Like, are you doing reproduction?
Reproduction, yes. We are actually accelerating the rate at which this would normally grow in the wild. How
does that happen? Is it giving it the nutrients it wants? Because it doesn't sound like it needs much nutrients or much light. So what does it want?
It is very slow to propagate on its own. So we would actually be able to, we've developed a method that would propagate this even faster. So it involves taking cuttings of the material. And this is something that is a little bit of IP on how it's done, but we're taking these marine organisms and actually being able to cut them apart, have them grow new parts, and then sticking them in the substrate, helping them grow even faster in a more dense environment than would otherwise be available in the natural environment.
Interesting. So it's almost like they've been living on this planet for a few billion years, waiting for some kind of reproductive facilitator to come along, and it's you guys.
Yeah, essentially so. It's just we're trying to harness nature and to make it more efficient. Our intervention is not really that sophisticated. So other than having the facility to actually be able to make these cuttings, so to speak, of these organisms, we are not doing anything else that is out of the ordinary. So no extra energy being consumed unless we build like floating platforms, in which case we need something to transport and ship things back and forth. But for what we're doing on the coastline of what we're going to we're going to approach this organization about using their coastal space. If we do that, then there's not really much transportation that's necessary to get the material to and from the coast to the facility. That's where the processing would take place.
I'm curious, and my mind is always stuck offshore, of course. Is the part of the cutting stage, is that a particular judicious step, or is it amenable to automation?
It is something that it might be amenable to automation. Right now, it's something that is definitely there's a step that requires you actually apply something to a particular portion of the cutting. So that might be it could be automated. Of course, anything that's manual can be automated, but we haven't explored that possibility yet because we still need to create some jobs for people.
Well, because it's an interesting. Certainly, when you're going offshore, it's not an either or. I mean, all of the land operations can proceed intact according to plan, but the offshore scenarios allow a capability to be expanded potentially exponentially by completely reinvesting the products as infrastructure for more of the operation itself.
Yeah, we suggest you do it in the open waters. No, but I mean, obviously you've thought about this because you mentioned, transportation costs and flotation considerations like that.
Yeah, if there is a low cost way of actually doing this in the open ocean, we would much more prefer to do it in the open ocean. It is there's 75% of the Earth is covered by ocean. It's a huge area to proceed with, and we just haven't thought of it as much as just because we had the availability of a more coastal site to work with.
Right. I mean, okay, and so now that leads me to wonder about the question of nutrients. So you did mention that there's plenty of nutrients. It doesn't need very many nutrients. Do you know what it needs? Like, some things are really hungry for nitrates. We have found, and that can represent a significant part of the effort. If you're not where there's a lot of that, obviously you don't have to worry about that now, but have you looked into that? Like, if it was to expand into other areas that have different nutrient levels, is this the type of thing where it really just wants that calcium bicarbonate? And because that's actually what it's making itself out of.
Well, it definitely wants calcium. It's very low in nitrate requirements, so we're not looking at it being necessary to locate it like in the Gulf of Mexico or so. That would actually be a humongous amount of nutrient for it. Phosphorus is always good. That's something else that can improve growth, and it prefers warmer coastal waters to colder coastal waters. So, but it's something that if we're out in the open ocean, the lack of proximity to land is not a problem because it doesn't require huge amounts of nitrate.
And do you happen to know the micromoles of any of these things that it tends to require? Like, some of these papers out there will show, like, oh yeah, here's this species, we tested it with this amount of micromoles of phosphorus or nitrates or different things. Do you happen to know, like, what it needs specifically in terms of on a micromole level?
I probably have the information somewhere, but not readily available for this call. As far as we've been doing calculations to determine how much CO2 it can pull up, and how much it will be stored in calcium carbonate. We also, as far as nutrient input, we don't have the resources right now, but we can certainly follow up later with that.
Okay, cool. And then the other thing I was just wondering, like, is this all happening inside like a crab cage type thing, or like a fishery? Like, you're protecting it from because otherwise you would lose it; it would just go away. Right? Is this kind of like a farmed fishing operation?
These are not mobile animals, so they're not going to go away. These are sessile, basically still. They're not moving anywhere. Once they're planted, they're not going to get up and walk away.
Okay. So you can just use the ground, and that's what you're going to do in this initial test, and there could be an artificial ground if there needed to be.
Yes, precisely. Yes.
Okay, very very cool, and it's really just it's a reproduction assistance. You guys are kind of like the IVF or something of sand dollars or whatever it is. Like, okay, very very cool that there's other ways, more and more ways to get CO2 out of the air, and such a cool one that has uses in cement, and who knows what else. It seems like there's a lot of, especially composites, that
Arin,
I'm
picking up on like a slight little hint of species envy.
What I love about the species is that it doesn't need a lot of nitrates. Oh my gosh. Thank goodness there's a species out there that doesn't need a lot of nitrates. I like Serena's question about is there...
Well, yeah,
robotics?
it's just flashing synergy to me.
Yeah, and I've also I've looked up Pull to Refresh, and I know that you guys are a team competing for the XPRIZE, and we had some plans to compete for the XPRIZE as well. So it might be worth another follow-up call to see where we might overlap.
Yeah, we have assimilated with another team already, and we have 2 other teams that we've made friends with. We joke that they're like our nemesis, but we're all very friendly with each other so far. It's been a really cool community as we're meeting more of our colleagues in this.
If you can imagine, if we all team up and there's ultimately just one team, everybody wins.
That's a really good way to get back at Elon Musk for making us compete with each other. What a twisted person. Competing to save the world?
Yeah, so we'll just all cross the finishing line, and thank you very much, Elon.
No, we're all fanboys. We wouldn't be here, fanboys and girls, if we weren't. But
there are definite opportunities for synergy, and we should definitely have a follow-up.
Yes, that would be great.
I wanted to say also that the project Cyan is so cool. I mean, I can just see as people are going back to school, science teachers loving this thing, or people who are I mean, what a great way for young people especially to learn kind of what about the carbon cycle and about the fact that the air, like when people assume that when trees grow that it's the water and the dirt that makes the tree, and it's actually mostly the air, and people don't understand that, and it's a really beautiful way for people to be hands-on and build a chemical reactor in their kitchen or whatever. I just think it's a great idea, and so I think it's cool that you guys did.
Well, yeah, and Arin, you told us an anecdote, but it's a very good and poignant example here in terms of getting empowerment in the hands of the upcoming generation, so they can turn to their parents and grandparents and ask them, what are they doing? And wasn't there a recent anecdote in terms of...
Oh, yeah. It was actually my cousin, who's pretty young, like about 10-ish, and asked his dad, like, so what are we doing? It's like he just found out, like, the bad news, and was pretty horrified, and asked his dad, like, what are we doing about this? Like, his dad's supposed to take care of him, supposed to protect any of the problems in this world. And the answer was, oh, well, we just ordered a bunch of solar panels. And he thought he was a hero in that moment. Like, oh, I got my son covered. I'm getting the solar panels. He's going to be so happy that I have an answer to his question. And his kid was like, okay, great, but what else are we doing? Because it was just so clear that, like, that wasn't going to be enough. That was going to be a drop in the bucket, that we still have a problem. Yeah, okay, we have solar panels on our roof, but we still have a problem.
Yeah, I find that I often think about, well, what am I going to leave the world? Am I going to leave the world in a better place than how I found it? So far, I have not done that good of a job because I've, like all the rest of us, live in a country where there's just a lot of consumption. And as a person who consumes, and even though I have solar on my home, I drive once a week, I eat like no to low meat, that's not enough. One person can't be counted on to do all of the carbon sequestration that is necessary to remove one person's footprint. We need all of us. We need all of our solutions. We need to do carbon removal at a sufficient scale to leave the planet better for our children. Because ultimately, that's why I started the Cyan project. One of the reasons why I thought it was important to have education as a goal. Our children are going to be those who will inherit what we leave behind. And it's important that they understand what they're dealing with. From a very young age, if they can see what carbon removal is like, they can hopefully grow up with that mindset and tackle what we do not tackle today. Because even though we're trying, within our immediate circle, there's still vast portions of the world that are doing status quo, business as usual. And our children are going to be those who will actually inherit much of the work that will need to be done, unfortunately.
And so how cool is it that they'll have the intuition to have learned early on what variables are at play? And if nothing else, from trying to do marketing and outreach and promote certain ideas, we won't be up against this battle of kind of the way nature and biology and chemistry was taught, that for some reason still has people stuck on this idea that, like, wait, I didn't know that you could remove CO2 from the air. Like, I thought we just had to wait for, more trees to get planted. Like, unfortunately, the memo that we have a problem has gotten out, but the memo that there's a solution it doesn't seem to have gotten out yet. So that's what's so cool about all of these different projects and the XPRIZE and these conversations. We're going to keep having more of these special guests. Thank you so much, Dahl, for being a special guest today. I'm speaking for everyone, but I'm pretty sure we're all like very, very blown away by the ideas that you shared with us. Anyone else want to chime in on any closing thoughts or gratitude towards Dahl?
Well, just that, yeah. I mean, I think we're all pretty impressed with your play. Well played, Dahl, with what you're up to. This is all just really exciting. So it's just great. Thank you for coming today.
You're welcome. And I just want to just some closing thoughts. I've had a lot of support from the OpenAir Collective in terms of bouncing ideas off of various folks, and they're a wonderful community that's very closely knit in terms of wanting to do something about the climate, with direct air carbon capture, or looking at water, or with cement. They're actually very much an inspiration. So I just wanted to acknowledge them today. If you are interested in joining, they're at openaircollective.cc. Just think of the CC as climate change. That's what I do. And I'll be around. So if anybody would like to get in touch with me, my email is dwinters@deepscience.ltd again. And I'll be on Clubhouse. And I really thank all of you for being such a great audience today and inviting me to be able to tell my story.
Cool. And also, final thing, I want to pass it to Raven. Raven, just give kind of a quick overview of our project, just for anyone who came in late and didn't know the context of what it is that we're doing.
Yeah, so for anyone who just joined us, we are Pull to Refresh, a team participating in Elon Musk's XPRIZE carbon removal. So if you guys want to follow along with our conversation today or just learn more about us, you can go to pulltorefresh.team, TEAM, and we were taking notes on everything we talked about today on our Miro digital whiteboard, so you can follow along there. And just to reiterate, we were currently talking to Dahl Winters, who is a CTO at DeepScience Ltd. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Beautiful job, Raven. That was great. And Dahl, this was so much fun. Come by to our rooms anytime here on Clubhouse, and we will definitely coordinate a follow-up to have another chat with you and just look further into these potential overlapping synergies and share more information with you. So thanks a bunch.
Definitely so. Thanks, Dahl.
Thank you very much. They say great minds think alike, so I'm really glad to have found some great minds here.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye, everybody. Closing down.
Thanks for listening to the Pull to Refresh podcast. Please remember to leave a review in Apple Podcasts and check out our website, pulltorefresh.team, where you can follow the technology and solutions we are developing.